in the mediation field for about a decade, and Ched had been working in active nonviolence and different peace and justice campaigns for about 20 years. Um, and, you know, we were immediately attracted to and interested in each other's work. We recognized that we had the same analysis of violence and what was happening in the community.
That wasn't the only attraction.
Yeah, right. But we were also sincerely attracted to each other's work because we had doubts about our own. And what we discovered in our conversation is that our respective worlds, Ched among activists and mine among mediators, tended to spin in different worlds. And for the most part, people that were practicing nonviolent direct action and people that were practicing victim offender dialogue or other types of mediation, they rarely talked to each other. And so, really, the ambassador's book that you have read for this class really was birthed out of that very first conversation, which was about, I guess, about 16 years ago. Um, and so we want to take a little bit of time to talk about that model today.
All right, and I want to add my welcome to each of you and also to Bill. Bill and I have been rolling together for 35 years, so it's always good to collaborate. And I'm very, very happy that each of you are studying theology and doing this work at SCUPE. And I hope that you will continue in the vein of both critical reflection and engagement in the church and the world. We want to be mindful of the moment. Tomorrow is, of course, the actual birthday, the 84th birthday of Martin Luther King. And this coming year of 2013, we're also going to be throughout the year marking the 50th anniversary commemorations of many key turning points in the civil rights movement. 1963 was really in many ways the fulcrum of the greatest social movement in the history of the United States. Some of those turning points, as you can see, include King's famous letter from Birmingham City Jail, which was written amidst the Birmingham Children's March, as it's now known in retrospect. We'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. The martyrdom of Medgar Evers. As you know, widow is going to be giving the invocation, I believe, at Obama's inauguration in recognition of that. It's the anniversary. It'll be the anniversary of the March on Washington, which is pretty much the only part of King's career that most Americans know anything about. And of course, the much more difficult memory of the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, also in Birmingham. So these are all events which profoundly shaped the struggle to dismantle American apartheid. And we just want to be recognizing that historical milestone. But even prior to that, we want to recognize that the seeds of that movement were planted a full century earlier. This last New Year's Eve was the 150th anniversary of the inaugural Watch Night in American history. Watch Night services.
Would it help you to hold?
No, I don't think so. We're having a little bit of trouble.
We're just trying to. We're hearing that the volume is going in and out. So is there something we can do?
I will try speaking more slowly.
It just bottoms out Like it's really loud and then it goes really down, really low for a little bit and then comes back up to normal and it's kind of really wavy like that.
Okay.
Okay. Should we
Well,
do this? Should we pass the headphone back and forth? Because that is so annoying if they're trying to listen to it. Let's try it.
all right. We're gonna try using headphones. Is that any
Does that
better? Let me try this.
You've been using that.
I don't know. Just give us a quick minute here.
That sounds like that might help a lot, Ched.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Take this. I'm using the headset. Okay, we're gonna press forward. As perhaps most of you know, the watch night service in the African American tradition can be traced back to gatherings known as Freedom's Eve. On that night, both black and free slaves came together in churches and private homes all across the nation, awaiting the news that the Emancipation Proclamation had become law on January 1st, 1863. At the stroke of midnight, all slaves in the Confederate States were declared legally free. And when that news was received, there were prayers, shouts, songs of joy. And African Americans have gathered in churches annually since on New Year's Eve in watch night services, praising God for bringing the people safely through another year. And I'm just wondering around the room if any of you attended special watch night services 2 weeks ago. Just looks like just one or two of you. I'm curious. Was it a special commemoration of the 150th anniversary of our church?
No,
It was
it's just that's what we call New Year's Eve service. This is just watch night service and appreciation for all God has done for the last year and being together in God's presence. So it wasn't a special.
No, I think we might get feedback. All right. So again, we just begin this way to.
It has to do with their sound.
I think what we're going to have to do is when you use SCUPE, you're going to have to step right up to the laptop so that we can hear you better. But thank you. We just wanted to begin this way to mark the time with sacred memory. And now we'll turn to the task of this particular session in your class. You've been reading these books, or at least volume 2. And that's where we develop some of these models. We, in these books, have tried to embrace a kind of a trialectic in which theology, contemporary social analysis, and testimonies of movement history, of living examples of restorative justice work today, interact with each other in order to illumine the meaning of restorative justice. And here we're just going to look at our model of full spectrum peacemaking.
Our societies have never been more in need of courageous and creative alternatives to violence and injustice. Street crime, police abuse, and domestic violence are epidemic, while there has never been a time in history more militarized. More people are enslaved today than 2 centuries ago, and poverty is the #1 killer around the globe. Torture seems to have again become acceptable, and even our entertainment culture is ruled by the gun. from personal alienation and family abuse to urban uprisings and social prejudice, from a domestic war against immigrants to an international war against real and imagined terrorism, we are caught in an escalating spiral of violence. This is why Dr. Martin Luther King, in his last speech the night before he was assassinated, delivered this ultimatum. It is no longer a choice, my friends, between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence. Two colleagues of mine and friends, one is Howard Zehr, who's considered the granddaddy of the North America contemporary restorative justice movement, and Barb Taves, they point out that since the founding of the contemporary restorative justice movement in Ontario, Canada in 1974, it has grown from a few scattered experimental projects into a social movement, and then into an identifiable field of practice and study. Some advocates are arguing that restorative justice has implications for our social and economic systems, but also for the way we live our personal lives. And so we want to turn now to survey the terrain of peacemaking for disciples today. Because, as you well know, in the face of this epidemic violence, we need to figure out how to employ all of the tools of nonviolence to be ambassadors of reconciliation. So you've read the first part of volume number 2, so you've looked at 3 models, and as Bill indicated before, we'll spend a little bit of time looking in more detail at the full spectrum peacemaking model. So it is fair to say that the genealogy of virtually every contemporary expression of conflict transformation can be traced back to 3 great social movements in the middle part of the 20th century. So that's Gandhi's experiments with nonviolence in the Indian independence movement, the civil rights movement for racial and economic justice here in the United States, and the establishment of the United Nations as an international peacekeeping institution. So these historic social innovations raised hope in, in progressive circles that even the most protracted political conflicts could be addressed through nonviolent means. So in the wake of the anti-war movement of the late 1960s, some advocates began exploring tools to resolve personal and community conflicts as well as political ones. And so over the last 3 decades, there's been a blossoming of mediation, conflict resolution, nonviolent communication, and restorative justice, which focuses mostly on victim-offender dialogue. And then during that same period, others have been experimenting with civilian international peacekeeping and violence reduction in war zones, political conciliation, and peace-building diplomacy. And then still others have continued to use the methods of nonviolent direct action to address issues of all kinds. So from anti-nuclear movements to nascent environmental activism, labor actions and other poor people's struggles, and then the more traditional forms of conscientious objection to war. It's our perspective, however, that although these efforts represent different branches of the same tree of peacemaking, they have increasingly grown apart from and independent of each other. And so divergences have even become institutionalized and in some cases professionalized, and there is really very little communication between these different camps. As you know from reading the first part of our book, Ched and I have come from 2 very different ends of the peacemaking spectrum. Ched, again, has worked for many years with nonviolent activists. My training and practice has been in mediation and restorative justice. And so as we got to know each other, we were astonished at how little communication and cross-fertilization occurred across these disciplinary lines. and even the ambivalence and distrust between these camps. So we are still very concerned about the practical balkanization that has evolved between the various kinds of restorative justice and peacemaking. We think that activists need to think more about how to get people to the table, to have conversations, and mediators need to wrestle with what do we do when conversation breaks down, or conversation is impossible because the power imbalances are so huge. Um, our concern is to reintegrate and interrelate all of these different practices of peacemaking, because nothing less will do. Oh man. I guess I'm going to keep going for a while. We usually trade back and forth, but the mic is difficult. So this current fragmentation, and I did a degree, a master's in conflict management and peacemaking, and the professionalization that is happening across all these different fields is completely counterindicative of what we ought to be doing in our world that is groaning under violence and violation of every kind. So even as our different practices of peacemaking develop and become more specialized, we have got to stay in conversation with practitioners from other parts of the peacemaking tree. We need to know each other's skill sets and each other's expertise, and absolutely recognize the limitations in our own practices. And so we believe that we each have the responsibility to weave back together this unraveled tapestry of peace and conflict work. I think you have run across our generic definition in the first part of volume 2. We define our task as peacemakers as this: nonviolent exposure of and responses to crime, injustice, violation, and/or violence, in which victims and offenders, their communities, and other stakeholders identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. This includes, among other things, covenants of restitution, reparations, accountability, and even reconciliation. So here is our full spectrum peacemaking model. And, it's trying to articulate a notion, a continuum of restorative justice strategies that vary according to context and stage of conflict. And so this grid outlines the basic distinctions between conflict scenarios. The most fundamental factor, as you know, is whether the parties in conflict are able or willing to be in conversation. So the vertical axis thus distinguishes between cooperative and non-cooperative settings. The horizontal axis, in turn, distinguishes between approaches that use third-party involvement for to address the conflict and those that do not or cannot. Here we should note that sometimes we presume that there are no restorative justice strategies apart from third-party involvement, but of course that is not the case. So within this grid, there are 4 classic strategies of addressing conflict. Negotiation requires relative equity and trust between the person or groups in conflict, as well as the willingness and ability to articulate one's own interests and ideas, to listen to the other persons or parties, and to find common ground. Now, while this is the ideal form of conflict transformation in the real world of power disparities and broken relationships, it's not always possible, nor is it always sufficient. So, moving counterclockwise around the quadrant, the conflict scenario intensifies. Mediation, and I would add dialogue, victim-offender dialogue, is used when people are not able to work things out by themselves. So trust has broken down, or power is imbalanced so that one party does not feel safe meeting with the other party, or does not feel that a conversation would be constructive. So a third party is invited in, or in exceptional cases is mandated to help the parties talk directly to each other and come up with their own agreements. The mediator here is a facilitator, and is not a decision maker. And this, is, of course, is the classic scenario where the victim-offender dialogue work happens. The upper left quadrant is usually called arbitration. And now we have moved from the cooperative end of the model to the non-cooperative end. Here, parties are unwilling to come to the table. Either they agree to, or an outside authority appoints someone outside the conflict to decide how to resolve the conflict. So at best, the parties narrate their experience, but it is the arbitrator who determines the outcomes. So this is the courtroom scenario where a judge or jury decides the verdict. The worst case scenario is the bottom right quadrant. Here, conflict is raging. There is no third party able or willing to arbitrate or intervene. And so it is in this quadrant that the rule of force tends to prevail, unless and until the creative counterforce of nonviolent action is employed by one of the parties. We want to argue that nonviolent resistance represents kind of the last resort component of restorative justice. We believe that these skill sets, the skill sets involved in each of these quadrants, are interrelated. And so we symbolize that by the interlocking puzzle pieces.
As you saw in the book, there's a way to complexify this model even more, particularly paying attention to the fact that in each quadrant, these sorts of initiatives can either arise from grassroots groups or can come from institutionally established or even sometimes government sanctioned policies. So for example, the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a government program with the power of subpoena, whereas the current Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada around the issue of Indian residential schools legacy is a non-governmental initiative and really arising from more popular initiative. So let's go back briefly over each of these quadrants, and I'm going to pass it back to Elaine because I think the timbre of her voice is liked more by the microphone.
I don't know about that, but I guess here we go. Okay, so negotiation. Now that is something that all of us practice routinely. You probably did it a couple times already this morning. We practice it in our daily lives, with our partners, within our family, within the classroom. Who's going to do the dishes? Who's going to use the car tonight? In our intimate relationships, negotiation is the glue that holds everything together, or not. So negotiation can be very informal and ad hoc, but it can also be more formal, usually when it's connected to institutional interests, at which point it becomes shaped by rules and protocols. So lots has been written on the skills needed to do negotiation. Marshall Rosenberg is very famous for coining the phrase nonviolent communication. If you look at his text, it is something that you've been practicing for a long time. So there's lots of different books written on the practices of negotiation. Mediation, or, I missed one there, sorry. In international business and politics, negotiation is often backed by threats, at which point, of course, it is not really within the realm of restorative justice. It is non-coercive and respectful negotiation that is the ultimate goal of conflict transformation. So every tool we use endeavors to get the conflicted parties and stakeholders into a circle of consensual decision making, which is represented here, the picture on the bottom left. So if negotiation doesn't work, mediation or dialogue is our first fallback. The art of mediation is ancient among human communities, with many different cultural expressions. Of course, victim offender dialogue falls into this quadrant and represents the area of greatest growth in the contemporary restorative justice movement. It is a far more humane and relational process than the adversarial legal tradition. In both negotiation and mediation dialogue, the conflicting parties are able to communicate directly with each other, and they are responsible for the decision making. Mediation needs to be especially sensitive to power dynamics and cultural dynamics in the room. At the same time, we need to broaden and to continue to broaden these skills to include institutional and political conflicts. Now, the challenging intersection here is between mediation and restorative diplomacy. So as we leave the right side of the grid and move over to the left, we have crossed over to the non-cooperative side. And these are the more difficult scenarios, but here actually some of the most creative work is being done. Arbitration alone doesn't do justice to the spectrum of restorative possibilities in this quadrant. For example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions fall into this quadrant. And again, as Ched mentioned, he mentioned two Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. Since the experiment of truth-telling in South Africa, these commissions have really exploded all over the world. There have probably been about 25 Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have happened as a result of South Africa's attempt to do a restorative justice project. Ched and I right now are following very closely what is happening in Canada around the Indian residential schools, and it's very exciting, and it is gaining momentum. And then there's a lot of questions and difficulty around these processes, but we feel like they're the most exciting restorative justice processes that are happening right now. And the work of applying truth and reconciliation to historical violations is something that is so sorely needed in North America. We also want to include under arbitration truce making and truce keeping work. Efforts at the grassroots level are sometimes ignored. There's a wonderful story about Akila Sherrills, who has worked to broker gang truces in Los Angeles. And then there's more peace building and inter-ethnic conciliation work done by John Paul Lederach. So there are very interesting experiments that are happening when we think of arbitration as truce work.
Also included under arbitration, we think, is civilian peacekeeping, disarmed peacekeeping. After any cessation of hostilities, the ensuing peacekeeping task that has to sustain a truce is a key practice, and we think it also falls in this quadrant. Unfortunately, the great experiment of the United Nations in international armed peacekeeping has been increasingly compromised by the US tendency to cloak our foreign intervention and regime change strategies with UN legitimation. So we want to make it very clear that US soldiers in Afghanistan or Iraq are not peacekeepers, but an arm of foreign policy. So with a compromise of genuine international policing, some groups have become experimenting with nonviolent disestablished peacekeeping efforts. Notable examples are Witness for Peace, accompaniment of refugees through war zones in Central America, the Nonviolent Peace Force doing similar work in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. This is an exciting, if a risky and demanding, new field of experimentation. And of course, with Chris Nestrick around the table, who just spent the last 3 years with Christian peacemaker teams in Colombia, we want to give particular mention to CPT, who are trying to experiment with doing violence reduction work to get in the way of oppression, as their slogan puts it. So these are all parts of the quadrant that could legitimately be understood as arbitration. Now we have to move to the notorious fourth quadrant. That's obviously where armed intervention usually takes place. But peacemakers should not concede this quadrant to the law of the jungle, particularly because this is the place and time in which so many oppressed people live around the world. In fact, it's been the context for some of the great nonviolent resistance movements of the 20th century and into the 21st. Nonviolent action is the restorative alternative to taking up the gun in this scenario of last resort. So obviously tactics include non-cooperation, such as boycotts, strikes, refusing to pay taxes, and active resistance, such as sit-ins, marches, symbolic actions, and civil disobedience. Now, a veteran of the struggle for social change has said all social movements begin with memory. This is a lesson that Dr. Vincent Harding Jr., who was a spiritual advisor to Martin Luther King and is the leading historian of the civil rights movement, has tried to press on us. Dr. Harding urges us to learn the story of the movement in order to analyze what has worked, what hasn't, to be inspired by the people he calls veterans of hope. Harding calls Dr. King the inconvenient hero for the United States and for our churches. Indeed, we Americans have truly been in the wilderness for more than 40 years since our greatest prophet was cut down by his own government in 1968. Similarly, Nelson Johnson, shown in the lower right here of the Beloved Community Center in Greensboro, has been modeling for us how to work in the tradition of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. Now, this is to us, to Elaine and I, and in our work here, this is a very, very important point. The question we're trying to ask is, what does it mean to be followers of Jesus in the tradition of Martin Luther King? And our friends at the Open Door community, friends of your professors as well, Ed Loring and Murphy Davis of the Open Door community in Atlanta, have really pressed this question on us for these past number of years. You know, early Christians often talked about themselves as followers of Jesus in the tradition of one of the apostles, Paul or Peter, James or John. Similarly, we have church movements historically throughout Christendom that have adopted the name of their prophetic founders: Franciscans, Wesleyans, Mennonites. And so one of the questions we are trying to ask is, should we be giving more thought to specifically identifying ourselves as Kingian Christians? And in order to do that, of course, we have to know the history of that movement. So a couple of years ago, Ed and Murphy gifted us Taylor Branch's epic history of the civil rights movement, the trilogy, each 1,000 pages, called America in the King Years. And so we set about a careful study of it. And throughout that process, we remembered and revisioned the sacred stories of faith and struggle in this country to try to reflect on what they mean for our contemporary discipleship. What we did as part of this process is we took a long-planned pilgrimage to Birmingham in November of 2009. There we visited the Civil Rights Institute right across the street from Kelly Ingram Park, the place where fire hoses and police dogs could not stop the Children's March in May 1963. Reading Branch's narrative of these events that forever changed the course of the civil rights movement really gripped our imagination. And when we entered into Kelly Ingram Park on a day that happened to be All Saints Day, 2009, I remember both Elaine and I burst into tears, feeling like we were surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Now, of course, it's a memorial park, but in 1963, Kelly Ingram was the buffer zone between the black and white communities of Birmingham, which was the biggest city in Alabama and considered by many to be the meanest. The spirits of the movement martyrs seemed close as we prayerfully walked around that hallowed ground, and because we know you're going to be focusing in this class a little bit on Birmingham, we want to again call those spirits into this circle. One evening in late April 1963, Dr. King wearily made his way into the pulpit of 16th Street Baptist Church. The movement had lost its momentum at that particular time. People were exhausted and afraid, and no one was willing to go to jail anymore. At the end of his sermon, Dr. King gave an altar call, asking adults to come forward to march with him the next day, and no one stood up. After a few minutes of awkward, tense silence, a 15-year-old girl stood up, followed by another, and another child, and another child, and soon the church was full of children standing. In the first few days of May 1963, thousands of children, in groups of 50, streamed out of 16th Street Baptist Church, marched through Kelly Ingram Park. There they were met by billy clubs and vicious dogs. This infamous picture of a teenage boy being held by a police officer as a dog bit his stomach was splashed on the front pages of major U.S. papers, invoking sympathy for the civil rights movement across the United States, really for the first time. On the first day of the Children's March, May 1st, 1,000 children were arrested. The dogs and billy clubs did not deter the children in 1963. Some of them managed to escape the clutches of the police and ran to the back of the church, only to come marching right out its front doors again. Shown here is the memorial gauntlet in the park today. And vamping in front is Martha Hennessy, who is the granddaughter of Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, who was with us visiting the memorial that day. On the second day of the march, in addition to the dogs, of course, the children were met by powerful hoses that bruised their bodies and battered them down the street. These fire hoses were the latest technology in firefighting, redeployed by the authorities to strike down children. And yet the children continued to pour out of church. By May 10th, 1963, over 3,000 children, some as young as 4 years old, sat in jail. It was the children's courage that emboldened the adults to rediscover their commitment, and they joined the young people in the march. The adults planned to do a silent march from 16th Street Baptist Church to downtown. Leading the march were 3 local preachers. This sculpture that's in Kelly Ingram Park today depicts powerfully the moment when the fire chief commanded his subordinates to turn the hoses on these praying ministers. The preachers all summoned the people to kneel down, and the firemen could not bring themselves to turn the hoses on praying people. One of the leaders of the movement was Fred Shuttlesworth, shown in the statue at the upper left. A local black pastor and civil rights leader, in 1957 he was chain whipped in front of a crowd of white folks because he had attempted to enroll his children in an all-white school. Fred Shuttlesworth was truly an ambassador of reconciliation.
Kitty corner to the park is the 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 months after the Children's March, during Sunday school on September 15th, 15 sticks of dynamite blew apart the church, killed 4 little girls in the basement changing room, and injured 20 others. Prime suspects were the Ku Klux Klan and Nasirima, a white supremacist organization whose name is American spelled backwards. This event was a turning point in generating broad sympathy for the civil rights movement. And after we visited the memorial inside the church, we went to the corner and saw this memorial to the 4 young girls. On this plaque was inscribed 2 Corinthians 5:20. And having just completed our Ambassadors of Reconciliation book, inspired by the same verse, we were deeply moved. For us, the pilgrimage to Birmingham was a catechism in the 4th and most difficult quadrant of the peacemaking model, the power of nonviolent resistance to oppression. We might rename the 4 quadrants as follows. Negotiation is peace building. Mediation is peacemaking. Arbitration and truce work is peacekeeping. And nonviolent struggle is peace waging. But whatever we call these trajectories of engagement, the challenge is to intervene as early as possible in a given conflict. And obviously, the best sort of peace work is preventative, proactively addressing issues of structural violence and injustice, which lie at the root of most conflicts. Wherever we do intervene, however, our task is to try to move the process steadily clockwise around the circle, de-escalating the conflict, equalizing power, and enabling stakeholders to get to the negotiating table. Conversely, in the real world, as conflict escalates, there are always options for nonviolent intervention in any quadrant. So this model suggests that peacemaking and restorative justice requires all of these tools and competencies, and indeed that they are interdependent, which means that all of us practitioners need each other. Gandhi called his spinning wheel his most powerful nonviolent weapon. So we all must work more consciously, no matter what expression of restorative justice or peacemaking we are engaged in, to spin a more integral, inclusive, and holistic fabric as ambassadors of reconciliation. I think through the rest of the course, you're going to read the rest of Volume 2, or maybe you have already done that. The process of writing Volume 2 was very inspiring for me. I got to interview 9 people who Ched and I consider cutting edge practitioners who embody in our time this kind of faith-based peacemaking. Harley Eagle is a Dakota Sultu and Mennonite restorative justice trainer from my hometown, just outside of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Joe Avila killed a young woman in a drunk driving accident and has devoted his life to preventing similar tragedies as part of his Christian discipleship. Marietta Yeager, a lay Catholic who responded to the murder of her daughter by organizing against the death penalty. Myrna Betke, a Methodist pastor whose brother was killed in the 9/11 attacks, responded by going to stand with civilian victims of U.S. retaliatory bombing in Afghanistan. James Loney, a Christian peacemaker team member who, while in Iraq documenting human rights abuses, was kidnapped and held in Iraq for 4 months. Lawrence Hart, whose story, a Cheyenne peace chief and Mennonite pastor who is working to repatriate Native American remains. And I realize I skipped two, I'm sorry. Murphy Davis, Ched referred to her earlier, has worked at both ends of a spectrum that she names um, the homeless folks on the streets of Atlanta, to a death penalty advocate for those who are held on death row and their families. Elizabeth McAllister, who led the nonviolent direct action movement in the expression of plowshares, where she works to disarm our nation of its nuclear weapons and our hearts. And finally, Nelson Johnson, who we've referred to a little bit. Particularly in the book, we focus on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Greensboro.
So we can consider each of these people that Elaine profiled not necessarily famous, but incredibly exemplary ambassadors of reconciliation, which is a vocation that we believe we all are called to as part of our Christian discipleship. Dr. King, in his most consequential speech delivered exactly 1 year before he was assassinated, ended it with a kind of an altar call, um, inviting us to choose in each moment of history. Today, if you go visit the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, standing under the balcony where King was struck down is this memorial stone which cites Genesis 37. Behold, here comes the dreamer. Let us kill him and see what will become of his dreams. For us, that feels like an unresolved chord that hangs over our nation and our churches, to see what will become not just of King's dream, but indeed we would argue of God's dream for beloved community. So we want to close our comments, and then we're going to open it up for a little back and forth if the technology will cooperate with us. We just want to close with a double benediction. One of the haunting icons of the civil rights era is this one. It's the stained glass window that survived the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. You'll notice that only the face of Christ was blown out of that stained glass window. Today, that image, which made the 1963 cover of Time magazine, still implies the question, how shall we become the face of Christ in a world of continuing violence, racism, and economic justice? The second benediction comes from Oklahoma City, which on April 19th, 1995, became a victim of the War of Terror. A U.S. government office complex downtown was bombed, claiming 168 lives and leaving over 800 injured. The perpetrator was a young, economically struggling advocate of white supremacy and a military veteran of the First Gulf War. That terrible moment offered us a mirror into which we Americans are invited to look in order to see the violence that lies at the heart of our national story. Standing in front of the poignant Memorial Park in Oklahoma City today is a statue of Jesus weeping. It alludes to the moment in Luke's Gospel where Jesus approaches Jerusalem and tearfully laments, "Would that you knew the things that make for peace." It's our hope and our intention in doing this work with you that we will all be accountable to Dr. King's summons and to that missing face of Christ in the stained glass window, and above all, to Jesus' lament, longing for us to know all of the things, the full spectrum of things that will make for peace in our time. So right now, Charlotte, if you would turn their microphone back on.
That's good.
I think we are going to attempt to do a little back and forth. Is that right, Bill and Chris? And it will be important for each of you as you speak to step up to wherever the microphone is in your room. And if you wouldn't mind reintroducing yourself before you make your comment or ask your question, we'll try to do a little back and forth. I think, Bill, we've got better than a half an hour for some exchange. Is that right? We're not hearing you, so.
Maybe because we did.
I'm going to suggest that it might be good for you all to take a 2-minute stretch break while we try to figure out how to get your sound to us. If that doesn't work, you can chat questions to us using the chat function on the right.
It probably helps if you turn on our microphone, right, Ched? So I think we got the microphone on, so you should be able to hear us better.
I'm going to thank you for the third time. That was really a fine presentation. Not only noting the moment, the anniversary moments that we're in, but you really do take careful account of our own work and intention. So thank you for both those things, and for the work that you all did on the book. I guess we'll just open it up. Are there people, we raised some questions earlier this morning, so I know there's questions out here. Someone want to just step up and.
I mean, I have a question. This is Chris Nestrick. I working in particular for Elaine. I've been the work in Colombia and the peace negotiations that are going on there, and thinking, speaking to people, and just hearing one time that for peace, for negotiations to happen and peace to happen, that majority of the human rights abuses that have taken place in Colombia will have to be left in impunity. And this is actually, and I was just wondering, how do you see how negotiations function, particular, and the prosecution, like in particular in like internet and war crimes and stuff, and the prosecution of perpetrators of those acts. I guess just if you could talk a little bit on that, like how do you see that as a role in this full spectrum peacemaking, particularly in, yeah.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
absolutely. And I hear that all the time, that we just have to let sleeping dogs lie. Why, what's happening in Canada? Why do we have to revisit the horror of the Indian residential school? Is it really that helpful? And part of what we're struggling with, one, we cannot move forward if we have not told the stories and the truth of all the horror and violation that happened. There has got to be acknowledgement for victims, absolutely, and victims' families, but also for offenders. Part of what I'm wrestling with is to what degree do victims have to name the complete horror? Is there, and this is a new piece for me, is when I was doing work in prison, particularly with lifers who had committed very violent crimes, it was absolutely necessary for those, it was men that I was working with, for those men to talk in great detail of the violence they had done. Now, when I'm doing the observing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work in Canada, there is some question whether for victims there is a bit of a re-victimization as they tell the details of the horror, or is it what we have believed for many years, part of the healing for them to tell their story again and again and again? That is what I've heard from victims of severe violence, that they need to tell their story and they need to tell the details again and again in order to let it out rather than fester within. So, Chris, I'm kind of taking it in a different direction than you asked, but I absolutely believe we cannot get to a place of healing, to a place of moving forward, to a place of having authentic conversation together if we are not allowed to tell those stories and not allowed to um, recognize the huge depth and pervasiveness of violence. Those stories have to be told.
I want to jump in here and maybe have a little bit of a dialogue with Elaine on this, and then invite you to join in. Chris, my understanding is that this is not uncommon in political situations where some sort of peace negotiation is happening to affect ceasefire or truce. What you're talking about is a political peace negotiation in which one of the requests, certainly of the government side, sometimes perhaps also the paramilitary side, is that no one will be prosecuted or held accountable. Now, my understanding is a lot of what happened in Central America in the wake of the wars there was some of these deals were cut. That part of the peace agreement was that there would be no human rights investigations or prosecutions of crimes committed during the war. And and that is what it is. It's a peace negotiation that's done as sort of political horse trading. I think for purposes of just trying to be clear, I would not call that restorative justice, because whenever the perpetrators are exonerated and not held accountable, then that's not restorative justice as we are defining it. It may be a condition for a truce or the cessation of a conflict, but it's not yet restorative justice in the sense of healing. Now, in volume 1 of the Ambassadors Project, we look closely at Matthew 18, which in turn stipulates that it's really ultimately the victim who determines whether justice, whether they have been heard, whether their story has been vindicated in the community. And insofar as perpetrators are being exonerated as a condition for a political peace, that's a kind of political peace, but it's not restorative justice. Now, my understanding of some of what's happened in particularly in El Salvador and Guatemala, is that in the absence of public accountability of perpetrators, people have continued to try to do the healing work with victims, and actually have tried to continue to document the abuses, whether or not the government will prosecute. And maybe that's the next best step. So I think in the world of political realities, there's a whole spectrum of what's possible and what's desirable. But restorative justice would always want to push for some sort of process in which the victim has been fully heard and the perpetrators have been made fully accountable, even if part of that accountability is pardon, as it was in the case of the South African TRC. So that's some of the spectrum there in in those very difficult circumstances. My fear, and I'd be interested in your thought on this, Elaine, my fear is that um, so-called truth processes as part of political negotiations for peace are getting politicized to the point where that accountability is being traded off for peace, and that's something I would think we would want to keep challenging.
Yeah, because again, there is a healing piece that happens when victims are able to tell their story, um, and if they are will or able and wanting to tell it publicly, to have a public recognition of the horror and the pain, there is a piece of healing there. But if offenders, and I'm seeing it a little bit in the Canadian TRC, the church leaders are really skating their responsibility. Some church leaders are really stepping up, but others are just unable to. It wasn't them, but it was their, the folks that had been a priest in a particular school, or wherever it is. The difficulty, even for us in this generation, to acknowledge that that happened um, is hindering the healing of folks. And I get the costliness of church leaders acknowledging that, but it's hugely detrimental to the acceptance of the story of the Indian residential school in the nation, and for victims. I really think authentic apologies um, that have reparations attached to them would carry us so much farther than the litigation and different stuff that we're embroiled in, uh, and all the money that has been paid to attorney fees have not brought healing or closure to victims, or to those who were in church leadership that are squirming under hearing these stories of horror. If they could take some responsibility, uh, that would be a weight off of them as well.
And when the one last word, when the churches don't get involved in this kind of difficult processes because they're painful, or they might compromise the historical reputation of the church, what happens is politicians and lawyers step in. And whenever politicians and lawyers get involved in these processes, we almost always begin to lose the quality of restorative justice. Chris, anything you want to say coming back at that?
Even just kind of the context that this guy was saying that was, I think, in the pardon that was offered in South Africa, and saying that the Colombia may want to think about doing that. But even also the pardon for the human rights violations of the guerrilla. I know you named paramilitary state, but also like I think in Colombia, I don't necessarily think that the guerrilla group will be mobilized at this point without substantial pardon for the atrocities they've committed. Uh, so, which is an interesting dynamic in itself. Um, but yeah, I've taken enough time, so maybe we can
Just one word on
talk to
that, Chris.
someone else.
My understanding in South Africa is that pardon was contingent upon confession of the crime, upon some public acknowledgement. And so that was the trade-off. If you testify before this commission and acknowledge the crime, then you would receive pardon. Pardon that tries to disappear the crime, that's a blanket pardon where the crime is never named, it may be, what they're able to negotiate in Colombia, but that is very, very different than the acknowledgement and then the pardon. So that's a complicated issue.
And there were, when perpetrators came forward, again, this is my understanding, but when perpetrators came forward in South Africa, they were not guaranteed pardon. Uh, they needed to tell their story in as much detail as they possibly could, and then decisions of pardon were decided afterwards. And so some were not pardoned. And I think I'm right on that. I was years ago that I was studying that, but some were not pardoned, and you as a perpetrator did not know when you came before the commission. And it was the gross human violations that were not pardoned, but there was not the certainty that you would be pardoned if you came forward. Uh-oh.
Your
We're
mic's
not
not on.
hearing you. The mic's not on.
There we
Hi,
go.
my name's Brooks. Um, my church background is pretty conservative. Um, and so while I agree with these issues, my family and my home church does not. In your guys' experience, how can I sort of bridge a conversation about this? Because these issues generally are swept to the side as some sort of maybe liberal conspiracy or something of that sort. So in your guys' experience, how do I bridge that conversation to the more conservative reaches of the church?
Well, Brooks, that's exactly why we uh, did a 2-volume project and began with Bible study, was to implicate the scriptures in the liberal conspiracy. That is, I think, at the end of the day, one of the only ways to successfully animate the imagination of our churches on these sorts of issues is to try to persuade our people that the mandate to do peacemaking and restorative justice actually comes from Jesus himself, from the Apostle Paul himself. It's deeply embedded in Scripture, and so that's why we wanted to do Bible study, and then we wanted to also do social analysis, and we wanted to look at what real people in real circumstances are actually doing in order to try to deal with the theological excuses and deal with the political excuses and deal with the personal excuses that we all make about, well, I could never do this. That's why we profiled regular people, not famous people, because not many of us see ourselves as the next Martin Luther King. But our job, of course, is to be an ambassador of reconciliation where we are, in the context that we are. So anyway, I would really urge you in approaching your church to let Scripture do the heavy lifting. And we've tried to make that case in at least 4 different texts in the New Testament: Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, Book of Ephesians, and 2 Corinthians, to try to give 4 core samples for how Scripture, how this work really is at the heart of Scripture. It's not on the margins of our tradition at all. So let Scripture make that argument for you, because conservative churches at least claim to respect the authority of Scripture. Now we got to turn the sound back on.
Okay. Hi, I'm Heather. One of the things we had in our discussion this morning was a question about, can you hear me before I continue?
Yeah. Yeah.
You can hear me? Okay. Was this question of privilege versus oppression, and kind of with the circle process, if people can't check their oppression at the door, for the conversation, kind of what happens then with privilege? Does that have the same type of idea that it needs to be part of the discussion in that same way? I don't know if you guys can kind of speak to that as far as the social stratification type of situation.
You know, one of the things, and again, I'm not sure where different things are in the book, but I think we speak about this. One of the biggest frustrations for me that continues in the mediation or dialogue circle practices field is that we don't do training around social power and how to address social power in the room. So the question you're raising, when I was coming up in this, and I started about 25 years ago, so that was considerably a long time ago, but I still don't think that mediators, facilitators are trained on how to respond to the issue that you are raising. And also, another criticism that I have of the training that we receive is that we are trained to focus on interpersonal dynamics and exclude structural ones. When I first began, we could only talk about in the mediation room or the victim offender dialogue room, we could only talk about the offense that happened, the crime. We couldn't look at larger issues of where these young folks were coming from, or even if it was called a mutual assault, we couldn't look at the that the other kid had the supposed victim had beat up on the offender 3 weeks earlier. We couldn't bring that into the room. So that has thankfully changed. What we need is mediators and facilitators to be trained in social power. And then part of what we need in that circle are support people for those that are coming in. You say those that need to shed or let go of their oppression before they come in the door. I'm not sure that is possible, but what needs to happen is support people are in that circle that are solely there to support that victim or the person that is feeling oppressed, so that they don't hide behind or slip in or allow things to go forward that re-victimize or re-oppress. Part of a huge important piece of facilitating these circles is that anyone can call for a caucus at any time, and people don't generally abuse that at all, because it's a you go and meet with the facilitator privately then, and the facilitator can really push what is happening for you in that private session. But that is a time for anyone that is there as a support person, or to name something if they're feeling uncomfortable with it, and call for a caucus. So that's one thought.
Yeah, Heather, that's exactly why we had the chapter with the conversation with Harley Eagle and talking about the power inventory, because this is such a live issue in current restorative justice practices. It's also a live issue for any form of peacemaking. Activists often are not great at looking at their own levels of privilege and the social dynamics in the room. Uh, but you mentioned the circle process, and we've done some analysis of the myriad of factors that Elaine needs to be thinking about as she walks in as a mediator. The the relations between people, the social power and privilege dynamics between people of race, class, education, gender, upbringing. Language is a big one. All of these things are factors that can't be don't disappear by naming them, but stop being an elephant in the room when they're named and acknowledged. How the room is set up, where the meeting takes place, the invisible factors in the room that might be impinging on people, like if somebody's there by court mandate or there voluntarily. Whether the mediator is perceived as an outside professional getting paid or a member of the community. These are all things that at least have to be thought of in preparation so that the ground can, if not be absolutely level, because the ground is never absolutely level, at least the minefields that are on that ground can be disarmed. And oftentimes when we don't talk about privilege, when we don't talk about context, why, what are the larger issues that are impinging on somebody's life? Is it unemployment? Is it their own abuse or alcoholism? These are all factors that need to be sort of mapped out in the preparation process in order to be named at the best time. And one of the things we're also interested in is at what point does the mediator proactively stop the process in order to cut short ways in which unconscious privilege is being exerted or racism is being unnamed, and go back to the drawing board and keep doing more preparation so that it's not an experience of re-victimization. Unfortunately, these things are not often part of the complex preparation for mediation, or for that matter, for peace negotiations. And that's why the peacemaking process is a catechism in complexity. And the more we can look at all these levels, the more successful we'll probably be.
And just one thing I want to add, in a circle process, I'm not working for a victim offender program now, but when I was a number of years ago, we were doing what we were calling community justice conferences. And, the first step was always to meet with the person that was labeled the offender. And we were working with juveniles at this point. And so we did this solo work, and I don't know if I would encourage that anymore, but I would go meet with the offender and family, and we would talk together and figure out who needs to be a part of that circle to support the offender. I do the same thing, of course, with the victim and victim family. Who needs to be there to help us have the most helpful outcome of our conversation together? But I would also include regularly, if a person of faith, like a pastor or a rabbi, or who from the faith community should be present, who from the mental health community should be present. Is it social workers? Is it addiction counselors? Is it anger management people? We would build a team, really, that are sitting around the table with me, because my responsibility as a facilitator. Oh, did we lose him? You guys there still?
They might have just turned off the video.
We're here now. Something happened, but we're here now.
Good.
Great.
Be here now.
Part of what I think one of the problems is for mediators is that we assume far too much responsibility for coming up with a decision, right? It's not on us. We are facilitating a conversation. If we have the right people in the room and the right expertise in the room that can help speak to the issue we're trying to work on, then we can really come up with some good agreements, some good conversation can happen. If the right people aren't in the room, the process suffers from that. And things like unchecked oppression, unchecked privilege just is allowed to continue.
So we're here.
Okay, good. We can hear you.
If we have to drop the video.
I think we have
Okay.
time for more questions. If you want to
Thank
give the
you.
mic to someone.
Some people had a question. This is a quick question, well, not, but the link that Charlita put out, is that for what was the question? Can everyone access that?
Yes. Yes, Charlotte is saying yes.
Where's that link?
Presentation on working with power within and
Awesome.
outside of the church. It includes some of the things you mentioned, but then more.
Hi, my name's Tammy, and I have a question concerning my vocation as a minister within the church. How do we, because many of us in this room are going to be actively working within the church or around the church, and how do we understand, how can we help our congregation understand the need to be the body of Christ in ways that are discomforting and yes, acknowledging that loss of privilege and power will have to be addressed in order to combat some of these very oppressive issues within our community.
Thank you, Tammy. Well, I think you're beginning in the right space, and that is by taking a class at SCUPE. And I mean that quite sincerely. The theological education and training of ministers has to include learning the rudiments, not only of scripture and theology and preaching and pastoral counseling and church administration, but your training has to include the rudiments of mediation, of conflict transformation, of community organizing, power analysis. And so the first step that you have taken by virtue of taking this SCUPE class is to become an advocate in your own seminary of how crucial this training is for you as a young minister, because we've got to get more of this into the curriculum and into the required curriculum of the training of our pastors. I think as we do that, the culture of what it means to be a pastor will change and become more broad spectrum. And as that happens, we will finally wean ourselves off the notion that the pastor has to know how to do everything. And we'll realize that the best church leadership is a team leadership in which pastoral counselors, community organizers, mediators are all working together to build capacity in a congregation around these issues. I think Bill will talk, if he hasn't already, about his experience at St. Peter's and the issues they've had in Detroit and how they've tried as a church to be facilitators of a citywide restorative justice process. That's the role that not just ministers, but ministers as facilitators of a congregation need to have. And it's a competency issue, it's a capacity issue. Church, how can we get our churches to become places where it makes sense that our adult ed program would be looking at questions of restorative justice and local community organizing? These are not impossible things to do at our churches, but they have to be very intentional. And that's why I think we start where we are and where you are as a student at SCUPE to become an advocate for the kinds of skill sets that SCUPE wants to get into our seminaries. And then, of course, as professionals, you're taking those same competencies into the field. We also need to advocate for more openness at our seminaries for the lay members of our congregation to come learn, who aren't training to be a pastor, but who want to learn some of these skills. These are all very concrete steps that you can take as a student advocate already, even before you get placed in a congregation. Does that make any sense? Sound, need sound?
Absolutely. But the following question I have is, who decides what justice matters and who gets to define the justice? Not everybody believes that um, um, women's reproductive issues are a matter of justice. Not everyone believes that um, racism is inherent in our structures within church. So the question, I feel, becomes more, it becomes deeper and I think more painful when we as a community, shared leadership, try to figure out what justice is for this particular community.
Yeah, thank you for that. And of course, that is the reality of all of our congregations, is that there's a diversity of viewpoints, oftentimes a division of viewpoints. Unfortunately, when we realize that in church, we become paralyzed. Oh, we don't agree on things, so maybe we better not talk about them. And so I think it's probably good, as we round up this hour and a half, to go back to where we began. When Dr. King and the children were marching in Birmingham, clearly not everybody agreed on a race analysis of America. Clearly not everybody agreed on issues of access and social mobility. Leadership is about transforming people's minds and hearts through the practice of bearing witness to what you believe is justice. Not everybody agrees what justice is, but people can change their minds. What it takes for people to change their minds is the committed leadership of people who are willing to get out in front and embody and advocate for a particular view. When the church decides it can't do anything because we don't agree, the church is at its weakest. When the church realizes that we disagree on some things, and so there's a need for leadership and transformation, that's when the church is at its strongest. But it's also when the church begins to experience the most conflict. And so part of restorative justice and peacemaking is learning to live with conflict. That conflict isn't the end of the story, it's actually the beginning of the story. As Gandhi famously put it, the truth is actually only discovered when we get into conflict. And so our hope would be that each of you 14 people around the table would, as part of your vocation as a disciple and as a minister, would make a commitment to become a leader and a capacitator around the whole spectrum of peacemaking skills, because you will not only need them to address issues out there in the world, we're going to need them to address conflict within our community as we address issues of justice out in the world. And so it's the best training we could possibly want to do is this exact thing that you are doing in this class. So thank you very much for choosing this class in your own curriculum, because I know it's a bit of a, you have to make an effort to take a SCUPE class. Thank you to Bill for bringing these perspectives into the SCUPE curriculum, and we hope that you will all become advocates for wrestling through these issues as you continue your own education.
You know, and I would like to add to that, and again, I'm just thinking of our church experience. Seems that when some in the congregation are willing to take on one justice issue, pulling that thread of one justice issue sometimes is able to lead. I mean, it absolutely is interconnected with other justice issues. But if there is interest in a congregation, even to pick up one justice issue, the pulling on that thread can sometimes lead to others being willing to pick up other issues. I think the struggle is to get a congregation to recognize one justice issue to become interested in. A number of congregations that I have been involved in have, started down the interest in the victim offender dialogue, because that's in some ways it's very easy to become a volunteer for a victim offender program, but through that have been influenced and seen, wow, this criminal justice system is broken. It's racist, it's classist, it's sexist, it's all these things. We gotta be doing stuff on a community level. The initial interest was working with juvenile offenders and being able to reach out with them and facilitate this conversation with the victim family. And then because of the exposure that they had, got much more involved in larger social issues. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I've seen that happen with congregants, plugging into a simple or a seemingly simple way to act out their faith, and then really being challenged, because pulling just on that little thread shows the much bigger system of injustice and oppression that is operating in the United States. So, all right.
I'm looking at the camera.
All right. We realize we're talking to the screen because we can see your faces here, but you're all not. We're not looking at you all. So sorry about that. Well, thank you. It has been very good to be with you this morning, afternoon for you. And I know we get another time together at the end of your class, so we really look forward to that. And what we have planned for that is really just to open it up and hear your questions so that we can talk together. So we hope that you have a very good week. We are grateful that you've come to do this work, and look forward to catching up with you at the end of your week. So thank you. Word from you.
I was gonna add one thing.